There once was a human entity. It could be either a man or woman, but for the sake of simplicity, we are going to call this entity a him. His name is Shiman. In a location in the middle of the desert, the clouds are dark, and a flash of lightning sears the earth plane. The lightning bolt had a mission, and it was to deposit one human entity right in the middle of this barren land. Shiman materialized in the spot where the bolt struck. He looked around and had no remembrance of how or why he was here. He had no memories of past, present, or future. It was as if his mind had been erased of all history. Shiman looked down and found that he was wearing a pair of shorts, a t-shirt, and a pair of old comfortable leather sandals. He reached into his pocket, although he really didn't know what that was. He just happened to be running his hands down the side of his body and felt something different. In his right pocket was a wad of folded paper with some type of fastener on it to keep the paper together. He thought, okay, I'll leave this in this area. Perhaps it might be useful. After sitting down and gathering his wits about him, he decided to strike off into the direction directly in front of him. Of course, he had no idea where he was going, but he certainly didn't want to sit in this spot all day. He noticed it was a little hot and he began to sweat. He started off having no directional instruments to rely on, only his own inner knowing telling him which way to go. Shiman had no past memory, he had no prior programming or conditioning of his beliefs, needs, or wants. He had never been around another human that he remembered, so he was strictly going by his intuition. After walking for a while, he saw something next to a rock. Shiman thought it looked rather odd. It had a metal shell-like body, one wheel on the front, 2 wheels on the back, and 2 handles on the back. You would call this a wheelbarrow, but Shiman had no label for it since it had never been programmed into his awareness. However, his instincts were telling him to pick up each handle with his hands. He did this and saw that when he pushed the wheelbarrow forward, that the wheel turned and moved it forward as he moved forward. He thought, I'll take this along with me. Perhaps I might find other things that will be of interest, and I can carry them in this. Shiman continued along his path. After a while, he saw in the far distance a shape rising out of the sand. As he approached, he saw something that looked like it had been made out of propped-up sticks of wood. He looked down at his feet and noticed that all along this structure there were hanging the same type of things that he had on his feet. As he got closer, he saw someone similar to himself standing behind this heap of sticks. He looked the human up and down and noticed that his shoes were very shiny. The man behind the counter looked over at Shiman's feet and said, "Need some new shoes there, don't you, sir?" Shiman looked down at his feet and said, "I don't know, do I?" "Yes," the vendor said, looking into his empty wheelbarrow. The vendor said, "Looks like it to me that those are old and out of style. You'll need about 5 pair. "Oh," said Shiman, and asked if he had a pair like the ones the vendor was wearing. "Of course I do, and I know just your size," the vendor alluded. The vendor came around his stand and brought 5 pair out for Shiman. Shiman took 1 pair of the sandals and put them on. He stood up and looked down. They were very handsome indeed with their shine, but he relayed to the vendor, "These sure are not as comfortable as the ones I had on." "Oh, they will be fine after a while. You just need to break them in. And you don't want someone else seeing you in those old worn-out sandals, do you?" Shiman put the rest of the sandals in the wheelbarrow. Shiman responded, "I hadn't thought about it." The vendor asked for payment and Shiman looked puzzled. The vendor held up a dollar bill and Shiman recognized it from the right pocket where he found the folded paper. Now Shiman knew this was money or some means of exchange. He handed the vendor his requested price and put his old sandals along with the new ones into the wheelbarrow and goes on. After a while, Shiman sees another stand and this one had food and drink. He stops and looks interestingly at what the vendor had. He selects several things and the vendor tells him how much is required. Shiman pays the vendor his asking price and stops under a tree to sit down and eat and drink what he had just purchased. Having no remembrance of food, this seemed to be an enjoyable experience. He went back for more and more. He just couldn't seem to get enough. The vendor happened to look down at his shoes and remarked at what a handsome set of sandals those were. Shiman smiled. Shiman, however, didn't show the vendor the blisters that the new sandals were rubbing on his feet. He thought to himself, perhaps I should put the old ones back on. They didn't do this. Then he remembered the comment of how nice they looked, and the shoe vendor telling him how bad the old ones looked. He decided that he was tired of eating, even though the food and drink never seemed to quench the feeling of hunger and thirst. He continued walking for a distance and noticed another vendor. This vendor had shirts, and Shiman stopped to take a look. He looked at the vendor, and the vendor's shirt had shiny buttons and no wrinkles. The vendor looked at Shiman and told him, "You sure could use some new shirts. That one you have on is ugly and doesn't suit you." Shiman looked down and noticed that the comment made him feel bad about himself. He replied, "Do you think so, really?" The vendor nodded. "You need at least 7 shirts if all you have in your wheelbarrow is what you have in this world." This made Shiman feel even worse. He looked in his wheelbarrow and there were just the old sandals and 4 pair of new shoes lying there. "I guess you are right," remarked Shiman. "Give me 7 shirts." The vendor motioned for him to select what he wanted, but Shiman shook his head. He was afraid at this point that what he thought appropriate would not be handsome. He asked the vendor to select his shirts. Of course, the vendor selected the most expensive 7 shirts in his stand and smiled a mischievous smile as he took Shiman's money. Shiman suddenly felt hungrier than he had before. He walked on down the path to find another food vendor. He stopped briefly to put on one of the new shirts since he was now concerned that he wasn't dressed appropriately to walk on the path. He put his old t-shirt in the wheelbarrow with the old sandals, new shoes, and the other new shirts. He noticed right away that the shirt was scratchy and uncomfortable, but he put that out of his mind as the sandal rubbed another blister on his foot, and his stomach growled louder than before. He stopped at another food stand and bought mounds of food. He took his selections under the tree, sat next to his wheelbarrow to eat the food. The food again tasted good but did not relieve his hunger. He looked down at his feet and saw how badly the sandals were treating his feet. He put his hand in the back of his shirt collar to try and find a moment's peace from the tag that was scratching the back of his neck. "Oh well," he told himself, "I need to look appropriate, don't I?" The sandals were making it tougher and tougher to walk, so he decided the next tree that he came to that he would lie down for a while, close his eyes to rest. Another vendor this time, with a wheelbarrow himself filled with shorts, awakened Shiman. The vendor stopped and told Shiman how bad his shorts looked. The vendor looked into Shiman's wheelbarrow and decided that Shiman needed at least 10 pairs of shorts, all different colors, to go with his 7 shirts. Shiman once again withdrew into himself further with each passing comment that depicted some portion of his original clothing to be inappropriate. This made him feel so bad for these people who didn't know him at all to tell him all these negative things. This is just an awful place, Shiman began thinking to himself. Once again, as the wheelbarrow was filled with more clothes and things, he became hungrier and hungrier, and no amount of food seemed to make that hunger go away. Also, now each new vendor was telling Shiman that he better watch his wheelbarrow, or somebody would steal his things from it. So each time that Shiman sat down, he drew his wheelbarrow closer and closer to him, so that he would not have things stolen from his wheelbarrow. Shiman put on a pair of the new shorts. Again, they were not as comfortable as what he originally had, but scratched his skin and didn't really fit right. This made Shiman uncomfortable, but he didn't want others to think him inappropriately dressed. Their comments about his appearance were really making him very self-conscious. His wheelbarrow was now getting heavier and heavier and harder to push because of all the stuff that was piled into it. His feet were aching because of the new sandals, his skin was itching because of the shorts and shirt. He couldn't seem to get enough to eat or drink, and he just wanted to cry. At each stop, he guarded his wheelbarrow so that no one would steal from him, and at each stop and after each purchase, he became more miserable. The path was not flat anymore, but beginning to rise up in front of him. The wheelbarrow became harder and harder to push. At this point, his feet hurt so bad that he just sat down next to the road and began to cry. A vendor happened by and told him how nice his shoes looked, and Shiman decided to try to walk a little further. He looked up into the sky for some reason, and the sun was bearing down so much. But all of a sudden, there seemed to be a slight breeze that brushed over his cheek. He thought he heard a whisper, but he shook his head and walked on. The road was becoming steeper now. He saw an old man along the path with no shoes and no shirt, and only wearing a ragged pair of shorts. The man looked frail and sad. Shiman stopped in front of the man. For some reason, Shiman felt another light breeze brush across his cheek and a whisper that he could barely hear that said, "Give." Shiman shook his head again but looked puzzled for a moment, then looked back at the old man next to the road. "Your feet are bare. Would you like a pair of my sandals?" Shiman asked the old man. "Yes," the old man said, and Shiman took a pair from the wheelbarrow and handed them to the old man. The old man thanked him profusely and hugged him. Shiman noticed as he handed the sandals to the old man that he felt better. Shiman also noticed that he became less hungry with this action. Interesting, he thought. I wonder why, he said to himself as he shook his head. He started back along the steep path. This time he saw a crying boy with nothing on, lying next to the road. When Shiman stopped and asked what happened, the boy told him sobbing that someone stopped him and took all his fine clothes, left him for dead along the path. Hearing this, Shiman was puzzled. He thought to himself, this is such a cruel place to be. The breeze came again and whispered very low, "Give." Shiman looked down into his wheelbarrow and pulled out a shirt, shorts, and a pair of sandals, and handed them to the boy. The boy was so surprised for someone to do him a kindness. He hugged him and thanked him. The boy then did something that Shiman had not seen anyone else do before. The boy looked up into the sky and said, "Thank you, Creator, for sending me help." Shiman was confused, but again he felt a strange feeling of being less hungry and more at peace about himself. Next he met an old woman on the path further up the hill. She too was completely naked, and Shiman just shook his head and asked what horrible person had done this to her. She explained to Shiman that she was robbed of all of her clothing and worldly possessions. She told Shiman that her belongings were in a wagon drawn by horses, and they were all taken and she was left on the path for dead. Shiman looked into his wheelbarrow and pulled out several pair of shorts and shirts and sandals and handed them to the lady. She was so tremendously grateful and began crying because his kindness had touched her so deeply. Shiman noticed almost instantly that he was really almost not hungry or thirsty at all now, and almost felt like he was glowing from the inside out. Shiman was glad that he was able to help and looked down at his wheelbarrow that was almost empty. He saw his old shorts, shirt, and sandals and decided to stop and put them back on. He had decided that since the other people had been robbed of their fine clothes, that he would rather be wearing something less than fine in other people's eyes. The clothes felt so much more comfortable, too. What a relief to have the fine ones off and the old ones back on. He began again. The clothes also seemed to have a magic about them. They made him feel healed of all the negative comments that he had been receiving from all the vendors. He saw a ragged man sitting by the road. He stopped once again. He told the man that he would be glad to share what was left in his wheelbarrow if the man wanted them. He explained to the man that he had been wearing the clothes, but he was welcome to them if he liked. The man nodded and smiled, delighted to have something besides his one set of rags to cover his body. The old man took the last garments for the wheelbarrow and thanked him. Shiman heard the whisper again, "Give." He looked down into the wheelbarrow and found it empty. He thought to himself, "Give what?" Shiman offered the old man the wheelbarrow if he liked, and the old man accepted it with such enthusiasm. As Shiman gave the last of his possessions away, the hunger and thirst vanished. He turned to look after the old man with his wheelbarrow and saw it transform into a white dove and fly into the heavens. He thought of the small naked boy, the old man, the old woman, and this gentleman. He looked into the heavens, as he remembered the boy doing, and feeling such an overwhelming rush of love, yelled out to the skies, "Thank you, Creator." The feelings he had from this experience were so refreshing and replenishing. Shiman felt as though he had eaten a full-course meal and been hugged by thousands of people all at one time. He couldn't believe how this felt. He turned to look at this path that he was on and noticed that he was at the top of the mountain. He walked to the edge and noticed there were 4 white doves gliding together, and as they flew by, he once again felt a breeze upon his cheek and a whisper that said this time, "You are so very loved for who you are." He sat down on the ground and then lay down in the grass beneath him, looking up into the sky. He just kept repeating to the heavens, "Thank you, Creator. Thank you, Creator. Thank you, Creator." He realized that he was no longer wanting, and that what he came with was the most appropriate thing for him. He also sensed that the Creator put him here to have this experience, so that he could learn that things are not what make you happy. Giving is more important, and others' opinions are not really of value. It is how you feel about who you really are that counts. Shiman was no different than you are. He came into this earth plane unprogrammed, if you will, and allowed himself to be molded by others' beliefs and comments. He allowed others to manipulate him because he knew no differently and was afraid to follow his own inner guidance of what felt truly good because of fear of not being liked or approved of. He found himself starving for something that food and beverage would not satisfy because he didn't remember that giving, kindness, and love were the things that really nurtured his soul, not simply food or drink that would fill up his human body. Shiman also found that things were not as important as he remembered, that only what he truly came in with was all that he needed, and it had been supplied by the Creator for his journey. Shiman didn't need to buy a single thing, all was provided.